Look, I want to talk to you about 2024. Yeah, I'm running for president because I think there's a big opportunity that we have. And with your permission, I've met most people in the room, not everybody. I think everybody here is either a libertarian or knows what libertarianism is, so I want to speak to you as adults and as libertarians, as folks that are on the same team. I'm not going to talk down to you or up to you, I'm going to talk right at you. By the way, as though this needs to be said, I am not the charm and good look candidate. I am not here to make you feel good. If you walk away from this talk feeling uplifted and happy and better than when you came in, we have failed to communicate. Okay? That's not what this is about. I'm here to make you slightly uncomfortable, actually. You don't have to be quite as uncomfortable as I am, but you should be slightly less comfortable than when you came in here. We do have a big opportunity in 2024, and that's because the United States is going in the wrong direction. We could spend probably a few hours delineating all the ways in which that is so. We could even debate about which things are more important, but let me just assert that as sort of a base-setting baseline of where we ought to be in full agreement. As libertarians, we are, in some philosophical sense, the descendants of the people who founded this country. And that means not only do we have an opportunity, politically speaking, in 2024, but I think we have an obligation. We have an obligation to recognize this country was founded for one reason, and that's to protect individual rights. Now, we can all argue that the Constitution was put together to do other things, and the government is obliged to do other things besides protect our individual rights. That's not why the country is put together. Nobody came to this continent for any other important reason. They came for opportunity and have their rights honored and protected. Full stop. Our government has drifted away from that purpose. And to the extent to which it has, I believe it is accelerating. And that is for a number of reasons. And again, we could all spend hours talking about what the reasons are. We all recognize that Americans get their news from different sources. We no longer respect people with different views. We all recognize that culturally we're going through major changes. I would argue that started in the 60s. Other people argue it happened 100 years ago. Plenty of people argue that it's been accelerating the past 10 years. But however you look at it, this is a country in which we have a government increasingly authoritarian because our politicians are learning faster and faster. They're getting better at putting into action the ability to manipulate our fear. This is where authoritarianism comes from. It comes from making you more fearful of someone else being in power than the extent to which you're fearful of giving up your rights, right? When a politician says, I need more power so I can keep someone else out of power, that's how it ought to be. You ought to trust me, I need more power. What you really ought to fear is a Republican, I'm a Democrat. You need to fear that more than you fear the loss of your Constitution. This is almost definitionally where authoritarianism comes from in a democracy. This is how it grows up. And we see examples of it all the time, right? Neither the Republican or Democratic Party talk about the agenda that they used to talk about even 15 years ago, much less 25, 35, 45 years ago. We all remember. I see a lot of people in the room half my age, so not everyone remembers. Trust me, Republicans used to talk about fiscal discipline. That was a long time ago. Yeah. Democrats used to talk about protecting your rights. That was a long time ago. Things have changed. Now, what's the big issue for a Republican? Keeping a Democrat out of power. Same thing for a Democrat, keeping a Republican out of power. Donald Trump is not the one who invented the idea of the one who beat him in an election being illegitimate. He's arguably good at it, maybe in this case, right? He's made a lot more hay out of it maybe than people in the past. Hillary said the same thing, and she wasn't the first either. Both parties openly talk about manipulating the Supreme Court one way or another to get their way. As a nation, we are understandably losing faith in our democratic institutions. To a certain extent, that's because almost every institution has let us down, whether it's been politically motivated, corrupt, often. The politicians have learned how to manipulate them. They have become motivated in ways that are authoritarian, that they weren't years ago, and in some cases we're just learning that they were always corrupt. These are opportunities for us. I'm not a big fan of saying it's a good thing that we're losing faith in every democratic institution. A lot of problems grow out of that. I believe that we need to rebuild faith in our institutions. That's going to take generations, not years. But it means that they have to be reconfigured, and we need to get control over them. One of the big reasons that we have such an opportunity as a party in 2024 is because people don't like the politicians anymore compared to how much they used to like them. Right? Used to be, people hated politicians. Now they loathe politicians. Politicians are the worst, right? Republicans don't trust their Republican leaders, and Democrats don't trust the Democratic leaders for good cause. Each party is split. I mean, one party is in power, doesn't want the president running again. The other party can't make up its mind about its most likely candidate. These are all opportunities for us, but they're all opportunities that grow out of the fact that we're going in the wrong direction. I would argue that we need, I don't like to throw around the word fundamental too often, but we need a profound change in our relationship with our government. We need a big change in the way we relate to our federal government, to our state government. We need profound change in the way the state government relates to the federal government. And by the way, not for nothing, but we need big change in the relationship between our federal government and the rest of the world. As unhappy as the rest of the world was with the United States federal government in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, we've lost even that. To talk about war just for a moment, it's not the only thing that we screw up, but just talk about war for a moment. Let me say something really stupid, even by my own standards. Put aside a moment the ethics of war. It's kind of a weird thing to say, especially the libertarians, right? Let's pretend that war doesn't have any ethical considerations. Again, profoundly stupid, even by my own standards. It's hard to argue that the United States is good at it. Now, on a tactical level, we're great, right? We're good at killing, destroying, taking ground, taking material. We're good at distributing. We're good at putting things in certain places. The nuts and bolts, we're really good at a lot of things. And I say that knowing that I have Marines at my own table. But as a strategic matter, it's hard to argue that we have, at the federal level, achieved things that the American people would agree were worth fighting for. It's hard to argue that Vietnam, the youngsters, get someone else here to be able to explain what that was. It's hard to argue that that went well or was a good idea. Henry Kissinger is still alive, and I do believe he's the only one on the planet still arguing that that was a good idea. And good for him for keeping up the fight, right? But you cannot argue that our interventions in the Middle East or North Africa or Latin America that we don't talk about very much, it's hard to argue that these interventions have gone our way in a strategic sense. There's a big opportunity for us as a Libertarian Party because people are beginning to recognize in this country that a lot of the problems we have are because of bad public policy. It's not just that the world is screwed up and we have corrupt politicians. People are starting to recognize that these two things are related. And I should be hesitant about accusing all politicians of being corrupt. To a certain extent, they are victims too, right? We just have this system. I do not believe the two-party system, in a long-term sense, is destined for success. I do not believe that politicians are leaders. They are followers. Their job is to think inside the box, not to think outside the box. So in this sense, I'm not trying to blame any particular individual. And even if we tried to blame a particular individual, it would be hard to figure out which one, right? There's just so many good candidates. We have a big opportunity to reach people in a way that we haven't been able to reach them before. I believe, however, that as a party, we are well positioned to screw that up as much as we have in the past. Think of all the things that we have not done well in the past. We haven't messaged well, and we haven't campaigned well. Those of you who still remember 10 minutes ago when someone said I was running for president, I know what you're thinking, is I'm about to say the only way to save us is if you nominate me. No, there are plenty of other ways, okay? I think it would be a good idea to nominate me, but it's not the only way that we can go here and save ourselves. Well, let's review some of the dumb things that we've done in the past. And let me hasten to add, by the way, nor am I going to say the only way we could have saved ourselves last time was to nominate Jacob, although I do think that would have been a good idea. Not enough people listen to me, by the way. Or nominate him this time, which might be over his dead body, but some of the things that we have done in correcting the past, I think, are very correctable. And let me hasten to add that even the individuals that were involved, I got no problem with, right? Joe Jorgensen, for example, lovely person, smart person, I believe a libertarian person. We can all argue about, on the edges. And we do, by the way, argue about it on the edges. But fundamentally, profoundly, basically, a good, she's nice to me, I'm nice to her. This isn't personal. But if you're on a bus going from town to town in the year 2020, you're not actually running for president. You might be just doing something cool, you might be doing something good, but you're not actually, in a modern sense, running for president of the United States. I don't know how many of you all know. I'm hoping that this comes as a surprise to everybody because it's a shock to me and it'll make me feel better if you would all at least pretend to go, ooh. This campaign raised $8 million. Now that's not a lot of money by Republican standards, certainly not a lot of money by Democratic standards. That's a lot of money by the standards of the noise we heard out of the campaign, right? That was the quietest $8 million I've ever seen. Here's the problem. If you have more than about $250,000 sitting in your bank account, you have done something wrong. Your job is to spend it by 5 o'clock. Your job is not to say, well, I got $8 million, I got 16 weeks, that's $500,000 a week, and I spend it just like this, I'll pull into the station right on. No, that's not how this works. You blow it on TV that afternoon. One of the problems that we have as a party is that at the local level, by the way, anyone running for a local office, there is no higher calling. Thank you. What you're doing is so much more important than what I'm trying to do. But we need to work together. The challenge is the value of the Libertarian Party brand is at best 0 and arguably negative. There are plenty of places in this country where you can get more votes running as an independent than running as a libertarian. The job of the Libertarian national campaign, at the presidential level, is to create air cover so that when you go and you talk about school choice, anti-war, 2A, whatever, it's not the first time people have heard it. I wish it were not the case that so many Americans expect that a credible candidate be on TV with ads in an expensive fashion, but it is the case. That's where the $8 million needed to go to, not gas money for the Ford. Spend the money quickly, hard, loud, noisy, try to build up momentum. There's no advantage in being in a 16-week race and then burning out. You might as well burn out in the first week. You need to spend it as fast as you can get it for this particular reason and because it contributes to raising more money. Now, the other thing, and by the way, you talk to Spike Cohen, I know some of you have, he would say the same thing. And speaking on a personal level, anyone says anything bad about Spike Cohen, we're going to fight in the hallway. Okay? Just by the way. On a messaging front, Never mind the tactics, the strategies. How it is that we choose what it is we're going to say. We need to be in the business of selling our principles because, not only because it's the right thing to do, again, put ethics aside. If we could put ethics aside for war, we could do it for campaigning, right? As a practical matter, why are you in the race if you're not selling your principles hard? Go back to 2016. I always get this wrong, so help me out. Our favorite governor said, okay, I think I got it. I'm fiscally conservative like a Republican and socially liberal like a Democrat. You remember that? If that's your message, you've actually got no message. You just told me that you're not in the race for any important reason. You're just like Republicans and Democrats. If you dislike Republicans somewhat and you dislike Democrats somewhat, you can dislike me completely. Because apparently, I'm also socially like a Republican and fiscally like a Democrat. I mean, that's what it sounded like to me. You just told me up front that you stand for nothing but pieces of the other parties. Why are you in the race? And I'm watching on TV and I'm thinking, well, I know why you're in the race, because you have libertarian principles, right? Nod your head with me, Gary. I'm sitting on my couch, right? And it's like, what are we doing? What are we doing? Why are you in the race? Now, he got more votes than anybody else in our party ever got. Why is that? Because the media viewed him right out of the box as being a credible candidate. And that's a lesson for us, isn't it? The lesson was, we might argue that Joe is more libertarian, and some of us might not argue that. But, again, with all due respect, running an industrial psychologist from a university didn't ring true with the media as being someone who they could at least imagine being a credible threat to go all the way. There wasn't the same commitment to public service and the career in public policy and all the things that the media expects. We could argue we wish the media weren't that way. But it is. And so are the American public. The American public believes that this is not just a contest among philosophies, but it's a contest among individuals. So your philosophy could be the greatest thing since sliced bread. But if you as an individual don't represent what I could at least imagine, I could imagine you being in the White House. It might be a stretch. But, you know, you're a business tycoon, you built a lot of buildings in New York, I can at least imagine it. It was hard for a lot of people to imagine it. That's why Gary Johnson got so many views in the beginning. And I would argue that the reason the Aleppo dropped ball was so important was not because Gary was an idiot. He wasn't an idiot, right? But who was going to back him up and say, that's our guy, right? We don't care. Remember Trump said famously, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, nobody would care. Seems to me that shooting someone on Fifth Avenue is a lot more important than forgetting a city in Syria. That's just me. But people backed him up, right? I think he might have been right about that. People were on board with him because he gave them a reason to be. And we didn't. Gary just didn't. I believe the lesson is that we need to lead with our principles and we need to lead hard. What I'm proposing, whether it's my campaign or anyone else's, is that we fundamentally go after the relationship between us and our government. I am calling it, as some of you have annoyingly been made aware, remember, I'm not the charming, good-look candidate. I'm the annoying, make you uncomfortable candidate. Am I succeeding so far? We'll work up to it. What I'm calling the Gold New Deal, a new relationship between us and the government. It's at goldnewdeal.org. Don't go to goldnewdeal.com. Just trust me. I know you're dying to right now, right? Don't go there. But at goldnewdeal.org, we're spelling out a 12-point plan. A lot of it is bread and butter. But it's razor sharp because I believe that we need to cleave hard edges against the Republican Party. And we need to similarly cleave hard edges against the Democratic Party. We are not like Republicans. Back to Gary Johnson just for a moment. By the way, it wasn't just bad on a strategic level, it's not even true. We're not fiscally conservative like Republicans. Would a Republican tell you that taking money from people and spending it on war is evil? No, they wouldn't. That's for us to say. If we don't say it, people aren't going to hear it. Do you just accept the fact that we're socially liberal like Democrats? I'm sorry, the Democratic Party does some weird stuff that I don't recognize. That's not how we behave. We stand up here for First Amendment rights. We're not all about canceling people and making people uncomfortable and standing up for what we thought was an issue in 1967. That's not us. We recognize the world for what it is. We are risen apes, not fallen angels. And we do not trust our government with too much power. That is not something the Democrat is going to tell you. That isn't us. We need to lead with principles, not just as a matter of strategy, but because it's the truth. It's how we feel about things. The flagship of the Golden New Deal is a new relationship between states and the federal government. What I'm proposing is that we do not just accept the Republican idea, the Democratic idea that is gaining a whole lot of traction these days of secession and national divorce. And by the way, I don't want to come off sounding like I'm anti-recession, anti-national divorce. If anyone in here says it's never crossed your mind, you're lying, right? We're trying to figure out how to reconfigure our relationship with the government, but don't tell me you've never had it cross your mind that secession might not be a good idea. Now, you might have given yourself an hour to think about it, and you eventually concluded that's silly. But don't tell me it hasn't crossed your mind. What I'm suggesting is a better idea than that. A better idea functionally as well as a better idea politically, because most Americans don't want to live in a different country besides the United States. Remember, when people talk about secession, what they really want is for you to leave the United States. They don't want to do it themselves. What I'm suggesting is you give a constitutional option to states to opt out of federal supremacy, basically. A lot more complicated, but that's the basic idea. Where there's conflict between your legislature and the federal legislature, you resolve it at the state level. You can opt out of federal supremacy from court orders and executive orders and federal legislature that conflicts with your own laws as a state going forward. And retrospectively, unilateral nullification. You can vote your way out of conflicts. You can unilaterally resolve conflicts between the state legislature and the federal legislature. In other words, in some sense, you would remain in the Union largely for only defense purposes. And we would end the relationship between individuals and the federal government through the IRS. The federal government needs money, the Department of Defense would just send a bill to Raleigh, for example, and say you owe us this much. The reason I'm such a fan of ending the relationship between us and the federal government through the IRS, anyone been audited here? Jacob, I'm sure you have, so don't even hold up your hand. So I'm looking at you, the kind of guy that they would audit. Been audited. It's actually a very pleasant process. They send you nice letters, and they're very nice to you on the phone. It's easy to reach them, and you have good conversations about principle. They do a good job of listening to you, and they resolve it within days. All of this is completely untrue, of course. It's horrific. One of the reasons it's so frustrating is because they're morons, but never mind all of that. 2 years, they were threatening to take a whole lot of money that I didn't feel like giving them. And they eventually agreed with me. I was terrified. Part of the reason I was so terrified, and trust me, as an ex-cop, it's not a real fun thing to stand up in front of you all and say I was terrified by the federal government. I was terrified because the relative power relationship, as Marx would say, right, is not biased in your favor. But if the federal government could only get revenue from the state governments themselves, at least the state would have a fighting chance at standing up to the federal government. Similarly, I would say any military action requires a declaration of war, and the declaration of war has to be backed up by a vote of the states. It makes it, we're all very pro-war crowd, I can tell. We need to make it as difficult as possible to go to war. Ethics aside, of course. We're just not very good at it. As an economist, I'm a big believer in changing mandatory payments, replacing the Federal Reserve with a rules-based monetary policy, and to give alternative currencies a fighting chance. If we get rid of the Federal Reserve, I think that we can do that. If the dollar wins in the long run, terrific. If Bitcoin kicks its ass in 35 years, that's the way it goes. If the currencies live side by side forevermore, the world will be better off for it. But we need to get rid of a federal bureaucracy that is dedicated to fighting against Bitcoin. That's the point there. So anyway, if you go to golddealdeal.org, you'll see a lot of bread and butter stuff that I think you'll like, and I think you'll see some innovations there too. The basic point is that I'm a big believer in moving the nomination process, and indeed the process of campaigning on the other side of the nomination, in a much more focused direction, focused on public policy, focused on credibility, backing up our plans with some detail, at least enough and more detail than the public media is going to demand on the other side of the nomination. We need to come across as the party of credibility because our ideas are, in no small part, new to a lot of people around the United States. Our principles will be shared, but how they play out is going to sound new. It will sound new. And we don't need to be just one more party introducing a new way of integrating fear into our politics. We need to be prepared to settle everybody down and explain that, no, ending federal supremacy, ending the Federal Reserve, ending the IRS in your life does not mean that it's going to be chaos in the streets, right? We need to be ready to settle people